Following the release of American Pie Girls Rules, today I have an American Pie ranking for you. So without further ado, let's get into it. Coming in at 9th place, we have American Pie Presents The Book of Love. This is just a really pathetic movie. I highly disliked it. Every single character was dislikable, and it actually says something about a movie if its main characters are so dislikable that you don't actually want them to succeed in their goals throughout this movie. And that's what I had with this one. And with the plot of this one, it's just so over the top. In the previous movies, even the spin-offs, they've been very grounded to feel more realistic, but it gets to the point where it just doesn't feel realistic. It feels way over the top. None of the humor was funny in this. All the humor throughout this series is about awkward moments. Characters are caught in some clever jokes. It really felt like this movie put no effort into making them possible. Because they couldn't come up with anything clever, they decided to chuck in, for what I think is the first and only time, CGI. They have this CGI, I think it's a moose, maybe it was a reindeer, I don't remember. So they do that for comedic effect, since they can't get any laughs out of anything else, and spoiler alert, it is not funny. No matter how bad some of the movies are on this list, they are still somewhat watchable, but this one, it really isn't. Coming in at 8th place, we have American Pie Presents Girls Rules. The reason I'm making this video, the newly released one, once I saw that was announced, I knew that this was going to be bad, just like most of the spin-offs. First of all, it does not feel like an American Pie movie at all. It doesn't have any of those elements that the other ones had, maybe because it's more modern. It only really has one connection, and that is the Stifler name, even though it's not properly explained how they're related. And just like the last one, it's another spin-off which has no likable main characters. The way they all acted together was very unrealistic. You know, they'd go from being best friends to have some arguments, and then the next day they'll act as if nothing happened. And certain characters, mainly Stephanie Stifler, her character would act all tough and then all lovey-dovey, and then she just seemed like a different type of character each scene. It was hard to follow the movie when stuff like that was going on. And not to mention a very predictable ending. Even if it threw you off with some of the ways it got there, it was still predictable. From the beginning, things got to get clearer. But yeah, if you waited 8 years for another American Pie movie, then you're going to be sorely disappointed. Coming in at 7th place, we have American Pie Presents Band Camp. This is the first of the spin-offs, and it's made very clear that the main character in this is related to Steve Stifler. You know, as we know, Steve Stifler is annoying, but we can't help but find him funny. Whereas in this movie, Matt Stifler, he's annoying, but he's very cringy and therefore very unlikable. The way he tries to act like Stifler just doesn't feel right. As I mentioned, it's very cringy, it doesn't really get many laughs at all. I can appreciate though that there is a difference from this one than any of the other American Pie movies. You know, we've constantly had a running gag throughout the series about band camp. We've seen scenes in band camp, but this is a whole movie pretty much dedicated to it, so we can see what kind of things happen there. But to be honest, one of the main problems I have with this movie is the characters' actual chemistry. There was none of it. Maybe between Matt Stifler and the girl he wants, there's a tiny bit there, but Matt Stifler and his friends, there's nothing there. You know, one thing that really annoyed me is they go from disliking him severely, understandably for things he's done, and then because he says some apology in the next scene, they all suddenly love him. Just stuff like that. If it's not realistic, an apology for the things he did would not be accepted straight away, and it would take time to heal, but whatever this movie needs, it's not a great movie. Coming in at 6th place, we have American Pie Presents The Naked Mile. Yep, another spin-off this low down on the list. And this is the one where Eugene Levi's cameos got a bit worn thin. He was the only main character from the series, other than the Shermanator, to appear in these spin-offs. And since you know that he was going to appear in all of them, every time they got a bit more forced, and this is the one where I drew the line. Having him appear so much in these spin-offs kind of ruins his reputation. He's a very likable guy, very likable character, but it kind of hurts seeing him in these movies. But yeah, it's just another spin-off. I don't know what more to say. It's another different plot. It still contains poor humor, poor acting, not too much chemistry, same characters that we don't care about. It's just another generic American Pie spin-off. It's just slightly better than the ones that have come after it in release order. But yeah, it's still not a great movie. Coming in at 5th place, we have American Pie Presents Beta House. For me, this is the most unique of the spin-offs. I know I've criticised some of the films before for going over the top in the films such as American Pie Presents Book of Love, but that was very forced, whereas this one, the whole tone of the movie felt over the top, from just everything the characters do to obviously the Beta House Olympics. I can't remember what it's called, but yeah, it's just something very different to what we've seen in any of these other movies, therefore one of the more unique, and it was quite enjoyable. It had a few laughs from me. It does rely on its crude humor, which wasn't entirely what the main movies relied on, so if you aren't the biggest fan of films relying on that constantly, then this might annoy you, but I found it to work really well. And I criticised it before, but for once in these spin-offs, this is the one where Eugene Levy does not feel forced in. You know, he has a bigger part, you could argue, in this, but he felt right at where he should be and it was hilarious, whereas in the other ones he was just chucked in randomly just for the connection to the original series. At the end of the day, I don't care about the characters in this movie, and if you sat down and picked everything out from it, it's actually not a good movie. But like I said, some of these movies, even though they're not good, they are still watchable and can be enjoyable, and that's what I had with this one. Now we've got the spin-offs out the way. Moving into 4th place, we have The American Wedding. You know, I rate this movie higher than most people do, but then again, I also share the same frustrations. I agree that it feels like an incomplete movie because it doesn't have a lot of the main characters or big side characters, or you could say it doesn't really work because they're much older now, therefore not going to be in those teenage scenarios as much. But to the latter, I think that's why it works pretty well. No matter how old they are, they still get in these scenarios, especially Steve Stifler. He gets caught in quite a few. It brings in a different environment. It can be quite forgetful in that sense though. It's just fresh to have it in a new place, a new area. And at the center of this whole comedy, there is actually a nice end at the time for Jim and Michelle's story. They finally got married. You know, at the time this was the end to the trilogy. They didn't know there was going to be American Reunion after this, but we'll get onto that in a minute. It actually kind of benefits from giving Finch and Stifler the lead. We get to spend more time with them, which was funny. And just to clarify, there's a big jump between this and Beta House, which came before, which you can see in my score down below. Coming in at 3rd place, we have American Reunion. This was the last American Pie movie to be released before Girls' Rules was a few weeks ago, and I just really enjoyed seeing these characters back together, even though they are like 10 years older than they were in the previous movie they appeared in. But also because of that, some of the things they do don't fit as well, as you wouldn't really see that happen from people in their 30s. So sometimes it's kind of forced to put them in those teenage scenarios, and it just kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. It was Eugene Levy's best performance in any of these movies. You know, he was emotional, but he was also hilarious. We hadn't seen too much emotion from these American Pie movies, but he kind of brings it down to earth, makes it feel more realistic. And as I mentioned, American Wedding was the end of the trilogy. This was made, I believe, 9 years after it, but it doesn't ruin that ending at all. In fact, if anything, it maybe even gives it a better ending to the main series. Coming in at 2nd place, we have American Pie 2. So now that we know the main characters, we know all the characters, we all know what they're like, we could just sit back and enjoy another show. What this movie does well is, if you hadn't seen the second one for a while, or you'd forgotten anything, it kind of catches you up on what the characters are like and what their situation is. You know, we have Jim and Nadia, Finch and Stifler's mom, just things like that. You understand what their goals and ambitions are in this movie and what they did in the last movie, so that it just allows you to enjoy things without to over-explain things. It has a nice little cliche story in its own way for Jim throughout this movie. One thing I found a bit odd and a bit unsatisfying was Kevin throughout this story. every character got somewhat of a satisfying ending. Even though I'm not afraid to include spoilers in this list, I won't do it here, but everyone got their happy ending except Kevin, who's felt very unsatisfying. Every person set out a goal in the beginning of the movie, and they all pretty much got it somewhat in their own way, except Kevin, which felt very odd. It spent time on its own certain side plot for it to only have the same outcome at the ending of the movie, so I found that a bit odd compared to the others. And just like the first one, it continues with awkward. But coming in at first place is American Pie, the original. Many people would have the same, I'd assume. It's considered amongst many as a classic, and I'd agree. I definitely agree that it's one of the best in its genre. I only first watched it about 2 years ago, so you know, I didn't grow up with it. I didn't watch it around the time it came out because I wasn't alive. But it's such a unique film. They have all these very likable characters and some of the most uncomfortable scenes I've ever seen on screen. Rhymed a bit there, but you know, such a thing as cringing at certain things, not because, you know, it's cringy, but because it's so awkward and uncomfortable. You'd hate to be in that scenario that you can't really bear to watch, and that's what I had many times in this movie. So they did that stuff right, and I love how like it has the character by himself or whatever, and he starts doing this weird thing that you wouldn't want anyone around you to see, and then it cuts away to something else or someone else, whether that's walking towards there or saying something about what they're going to do, and you kind of piece together what's going to happen, but it's too late for you to be like, oh no, I'm stuck in this now, I have to watch through this. And just as it's kind of the anticipation, I guess you could say, which is the part that makes you cringe the most, as you know it's going to be very awkward. But scenes like that I find really hard to watch in a good way, I guess you could say. And the humour here, even though this was made in the 90s, it still holds up very well. I watched this recently with my friends that they hadn't seen it before, and they laughed at some of the humour, so you know that's a good sign from a comedy from the 90s that it still makes people laugh. It's 20 years or 25 years later. I absolutely love this movie. It's also one of those movies, as I mentioned, it's really fun to watch with your mates. So if you ever have the chance, do that, but maybe don't watch it around your parents. So there is my ranking for the American Pie movies. That includes the main series and the spin-offs. So now I'm going to chuck up my scores on screen now, if you're interested in that, just to see how big of a gap in quality there was between certain movies. Please let me know in the comments what your ranking would be. I'd be really interested to know, as mine is just my opinion, so I'd like to see what your opinion would be. But yeah, anyway, really hope you enjoy. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in my next video.